People love to be scared. Something about the suspenseful music, dark atmosphere, and sudden jolt of adrenaline from a jump scare gets people going. For years, people flock to theaters to spill their popcorn at horror films. On top of some of these movies being absolute classics, many people just love the thrill of being terrified. But there's only one thing that's more fun than yelling at a character to not go in that door. Having to go into that door yourself. Giving the horrified audience agency was the next logical step for the horror genre's growth, and it was the perfect way to do so with video games. It's almost like walking through a haunted house. That's a killer segue. Haunted House for the Atari was one of the first horror games ever created back in 1982. The game involved the player navigating an abandoned 8-bit house, doing puzzles, and trying to put together an urn in order to escape the haunted house. During this, the player had to avoid many horrifying creatures. Absolutely petrifying. Jokes aside, this was one of the pioneers for not only horror games, but a subgenre as well. Survival horror began to take off in the 1990s with the development of games like Alone in the Dark. This type of game had the elements of horror that were seen in the movies, but also featured aspects of survival, such as inventory and health management, puzzle solving, strategy, and an unprecedented level of fear from the player's vulnerability. These were all crucial parts to these games, and you can trace these aspects back to some of the classic titles the genre started with. And while these games were all important to the growth of survival horror, none were more important than Resident Evil. A franchise that's withstood the test of time, Resident Evil is a multi-generational series that has created many characters that we love, games that are consistently featured on the list of the greatest video games of all time, and movies, we don't talk about those. But when a series lasts as long as Resident Evil has, it has to go through some sort of change. As good as the first trilogy is regarded as being for its time, as influential as the titles for the GameCube and PlayStation 2 were, and as refined as the games on the future consoles are, evolution has been the only constant across Resident Evil, as it's a necessary factor in the franchise's continued performance. Over the course of 27 years, these games have become unrecognizable from each other, but in the best way possible. Coping with change is part of the creative process, but it's not always an easy shift to make. That's what makes Resident Evil's changing styles that much more impressive. Every series has bumps in the road, but it's not hard to say that Resident Evil and Capcom have taken these hits on the chin and came back with a solid product every time it seemed like they were out for the count. And it all started with some people who really didn't like to be scared. In 1989, a man named Tokuro Fujiwara led the development of a game called Sweet Home, a horror role-playing game for the family computer, or as everybody outside of Japan knows it, the NES. Developed and released by Capcom and based on a movie of the same name, Fujiwara created one of the pioneers for the survival horror genre. The game received solid reviews, and while it's looked at as one of the greatest games of its time, its greatest contribution came from its inspiration of a whole new series. The success of Sweet Home and the release of the original PlayStation prompted the development of a follow-up to the horror RPG. The work for the new game was assigned to reluctant director Shinji Mikami, who, for the most part, worked on the game by himself at the beginning of development. For the first 6 months of development, I was the team. 6 months down the line, I was joined by another planner, but after 3 months of working together, he left to do development work for another project. He was eventually joined by a team of about 80 people, but this time alone with the game allowed Mikami to take many creative liberties with the project. During this time, the game would go through many changes. At first, the project was planned to be a remake of Sweet Home for the PlayStation, but development began to shift towards an original title in its infancy. It takes someone who can truly be frightened to know what's scary, which is exactly why Fujiwara selected Shinji in the first place. With his hatred of fear in mind, Mikami set out to create a haunted house-esque game. While the enemies were originally supposed to be ghosts and spirits, Mikami quickly scrapped this idea and shifted his focus to humanoid zombies, which were largely inspired by the movie's Dawn of the Dead. The setting of the game would consist of a large mansion that the player would remain in for the entirety of the game, with new areas unlocking and advancing the game as you went along. With the design of the game prepped and his team growing, the planning stage quickly transformed into the development stage. And while they were excited about the creative direction the game was going, the gameplay development wasn't nearly as smooth. Capcom's new game would take place in a perceived 3D space. Confined to the PlayStation's D-pad, the controls were unbelievably clunky. This movement was called tank controls and was nothing new for the adventure game genre. First used in the game Alpha Waves and later in the previously mentioned Alone in the Dark, tank controls were designed to allow the player to continue moving in the desired direction while also maintaining the cinematic camera angles present in these games. In fact, Alone in the Dark was the reason the game wasn't a first-person experience that it was originally planned to be. A fully first-person prototype was developed early in the game's life, but the graphical limitations of the PlayStation restricted the capabilities of the development team to continue with this model. To combat this, they chose to go with pre-rendered 2D backgrounds in which a 3D character could move around in with a fixed camera angle. Though it wasn't the nicest game to control, the overall clunk was and still is considered more of a feature than a mistake, with modern horror games featuring a similar level of frustrating controls intentionally, although it's typically done with a more tolerable camera. The first-person perspective wasn't the only idea that was dropped during development. A cooperative mode was also conceived by Mikami in the early stages of development, but this idea was also scrapped because it wasn't good enough, in Shinji's own words. Funny enough, both of these features would make an appearance down the road. On March 22nd, 1996, the game was finally released on the Sony PlayStation after 3 long years of development. It was given the title Biohazard in Japan, but unfortunately wouldn't receive the trademark in the United States due to a metal band with the same name, as well as a video game with a similar title, Biohazard Battle. Because of this, the game would be given the title Resident Evil in North American and European markets, much to Mikami and Capcom US's Director of Communication and Community, Chris Kramer's dismay. Resident Evil was chosen because of its play on the location and atmosphere of the game, with the zombies living in the mansion the player was dropped into. Despite its silly name in some of its biggest markets, Resident Evil / Biohazard flew off the shelves, quickly becoming the best-selling PlayStation game ever released and being touted by critics as one of, if not the best horror game ever created, a title it was well deserving of. On top of its expansion of what was loved about the survival horror genre with its inclusion of all the elements of backtracking, resource conservation, and puzzle solving, Resident Evil was a graphical masterpiece at the time, blowing other recent titles out of the water. It was also praised for its incredible atmosphere, writing, and characters. The ability to choose what character to play as allowed players to grow attached to Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield in a way that wouldn't be possible if the developers had chosen to switch between the two throughout the story, which was considered prior to the game's release. The writing was also spot on, providing players with intense moments followed by corny one-liners from the main character to relieve the tension.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
But that doesn't mean that this was some cheesy horror spoof. Resident Evil was still a terrifying game. On top of the zombies and other monsters flying through windows, the player would also constantly run into an almost indestructible tyrant, which a variation of would reoccur in multiple future entries of the series. The success of the game would prompt its re-release on multiple different systems: Windows, Sega Saturn, a remaster of the game for GameCube, Wii, PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 and 1, and even the Nintendo DS. However, Capcom didn't want Resident Evil to be a one-hit wonder. Like most successes in the media industry, the high sale numbers of the game led to the development of a sequel almost immediately after its release. The direction of Resident Evil 2 wasn't as clear-cut as the original, however. In the early stages of development, the sequel would initially be called Resident Evil 1.5 and was essentially a reskin of the original. Mikami stated in the past that he didn't expect Resident Evil to become a franchise, and you can clearly see this belief in the early prototypes. While the focus of this game was similar to that of the original and they had a general idea of what they wanted the game to be, the development team would go through some major changes that would disrupt its creation. The first departure was producer of Resident Evil, Tokuro Fujiwara, as he would go on to create his own studio under the title of Whoopee Camp. Another major departure was writer Kenichi Oeu, who created many of the concepts that formed the series' identity. Though he didn't leave, Shinji's role in the development of the sequel would also change, as he would fill the vacancy at producer for Resident Evil 2. He also played a major hand in the writing in the game's early development. Now, with the important spot of director empty, Mikami selected 25-year-old Hideki Kamiya to fill the spot. This change would end up being critical for the direction of the game and the series as a whole, as Kamiya wanted to take the game in a direction that was more action-driven as opposed to its horror roots. Why? Because he was easily startled and got queasy when viewing violent material. I can see why Mikami liked him. This wasn't necessarily a bad idea. The first Resident Evil was very slowly paced in terms of combat. With a few changes like greater weapon variety and more enemies, Resident Evil 2 looked like it was going to expand on the groundwork laid out by the first game by offering a more action-packed fighting scene to its scary atmosphere. And while this was all well and good, a major problem would arise as the game moved through production. The story. When Ueo left, he took the heart and soul of the writing team with him. This left Mikami to take over much of the scenario writing, a field in which he wasn't very experienced. As a result, the writing for the game was called subpar by Capcom. The plot of Resident Evil was an incredibly important part of its success, so a lacking story in the sequel would surely be a death sentence for the game and the series as a whole. With the plot in need of original ideas and the studio in need of a reliable in-house writer, they began to look elsewhere. They ended up landing on television writer Noboru Sugimura. Sugimura was a big fan of the first game, but upon playing the current build of the sequel in late 1996, he was incredibly disappointed with the story. He offered Mikami and Kamiya his feedback, which they agreed with, leading to the game being delayed a year so Noboru could make adjustments to the story. What happened next was an almost complete restart of Resident Evil 2. Not everything would be different, however. Many of the characters from the first design, such as Leon Kennedy, Ada Wong, and Sherry Birkin, would all be reused in this new model. The biggest change character-wise would be the shift of one of the other main characters, Elza Walker, who would change into Claire Redfield, sister of Chris Redfield from the first game. This was done in order to support the effort of making connections to the first game, which the early build of Resident Evil 2 was lacking in. The setting of the game being located in Raccoon City like the original would also stay, but with much more tweaking to its areas compared to Resident Evil 1.5, such as the police station that serves as the game's starting area. This portion was redesigned and expanded on, alongside many other locations. A feature that wasn't present in the first build that would find its way into the final game was a zapping system of storytelling. Like the original game, the player could choose to play as one of two main characters, Leon or Claire. However, unlike the original, the player wouldn't experience the same story beats with the different characters. Instead, Sugimura and Kamiya created a system where the player could experience the world in an A and B plot, creating extensive replayability and an intriguing story that had to be played through multiple times in order to get the full experience. In the end, an overhaul was the right decision for this product. On top of rehashing the story, the game was able to improve technically as well. The engine was much improved since the last release, and the graphics were a clear step up comparatively. The voice acting was also a lot better, but the bar wasn't set very high.
Jill sandwich.
On January 21st and 29th, 1988, Resident Evil 2 hit the shelves in North America and Japan respectively. The sales goals for the game was originally 2 million copies, a lofty task for a title that had been delayed for as long as it was. Thanks to a costly advertising campaign and general hype around the game, this number was crushed. The game sold almost 1.4 million copies in the first 4 days in Japan and over 1 million in the United States. Across the ports and re-releases of the game, Resident Evil 2 would amass a total sale number of over 6 million copies. With this, Capcom had established Resident Evil as a powerhouse franchise, and from here, the development of these games would take a bit of a shift. Notably, 2 games would begin to be developed alongside each other, Resident Evil 3 and a spin-off game titled Resident Evil Code Veronica. Neither of these games would get the attention the first 2 Resident Evil games received, as it was around this time that the PlayStation 2 was announced, and Capcom redirected their focus to a project on the upcoming system. Though this would typically mean the quality of the games would take a hit, both of these games ended up being very well made. However, the timeline between 3 and Code Veronica does get a bit murky here, so please bear with me. Resident Evil 3 was originally supposed to be an exclusive for the Sega Dreamcast and was planned to be a direct sequel of Resident Evil 2. It would feature a story about Claire and Chris Redfield and would be a direct follow-up to the first 2 games. The other game being developed at the the same time was an exclusive for the PlayStation 1. It was slated to be a side story about Jill Valentine and her escape from Raccoon City during the events of Resident Evil 2. But when Sony outbid for the rights of a mainline Resident Evil game, the roles of these games were reversed. This made Resident Evil 3 the story about Chris and Claire, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and the spin-off story about Jill, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. As Capcom was redirecting their focus to the PlayStation 2, neither one of these games would be directed by Shinji Mikami or Hideki Kamiya, instead picking Hiroki Kato for Veronica and Kazuhiro Oyama for 3. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis would release first on September 22, 1999, and Resident Evil Code Veronica would follow it up on February 3, 2000. Both of these games were reviewed very well, Veronica receiving the highest Metacritic score of any Resident Evil game at this time. That being said, these games were more of the same for the series, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The Resident Evil formula is one that was still working at this time, so there was no need for big changes at the moment. The combat was beginning to frustrate fans, but it was still enjoyable, and the games were continuing to get better graphically as time went on. The most innovative feature that these games offered was a simple ammo crafting system that was introduced in Nemesis, which expanded on the herb combination system that had been present since the first game. Despite the lack of growth in the series, the games continued to do well, justifying the release of one more tank-controlled game. The last game that was developed in this era that wasn't a spin-off was Resident Evil 0, a prequel to the first entry. While still following the basic structure of the first 4 games, Resident Evil 0 was definitely the most experimental of the first 5 releases, especially in terms of combat. The most notable difference was the accompaniment of an AI companion that the player could switch back and forth between, which could be frustrating to say the least. This wouldn't be the last time an AI NPC was introduced into a Resident Evil game. It would begin the common theme of poorly controlled computer sidekicks in the series. Considered one of the harder games in the franchise, Zero makes an effort to revamp the zombies, making them faster and more varied in their movement. To counter this, the player was now allowed more freedom in their movement as well, to make quick turns and introducing counterattacks when bitten. Zero also removed the player's item box, in which they could store all their overflow supplies in. This feature got a mixed bag when it came to feedback, but what was essentially universally despised was the traditional control system used in all the previous entries. Ever since Code Veronica, players were beginning to get restless with the series' clunky controls. Though they were understandable at the time due to hardware limitations, games released on the GameCube and even the Dreamcast were capable of much more than what was being presented, and the audience began to take notice. The truth is that if we were judging Resident Evil on controls alone, the game would be scored very poorly. There's just no excuse with superior control schemes like that used in External Darkness readily available for inspiration. Capcom again decided to stick with the less accommodating classic control scheme in which the characters rotate slowly to change direction and walk around backwards instead of turning around. Resident Evil 0 would have an up and down development, as it was planned to release on the N64 but would eventually come out on the GameCube on November 12, 2002, shortly after a remaster of Resident Evil was dropped earlier that year. 0 was still considered a good game, but it was the worst reviewed out of all of Capcom's smash hits because of its inability to expand on a formula that had run its course. And with that, the first generation of Resident Evil games would come to a close. These 5 games laid the groundwork for what would become the most popular horror franchise in video game history, but fans were beginning to get tired of the lacking control scheme these games were continuing to reuse. Resident Evil was at no risk of dying at this point, however. This series was still loved, even by those who were frustrated by the game's controls. Hell, some people actually still liked them. But the potential for what these games could be was beginning to expand. It was at this point that the Metal Gear, Grand Theft Auto, and Max Payne games were showing what was possible with a third-person point of view. It was time for change, and change was coming, in a big way. Remember how Mikami and his team were moved to a bigger project on the PS2 during the development of Code Veronica and Nemesis? This is that. Resident Evil 4 would be the next entry into the series, and I'm not going to try to hide how good this game is, because you already know. What you might not know is that the development of this game was rough. During early development, Capcom knew they wanted to make changes to their series. Though it was still fairly young, the industry had gone through massive changes since the turn of the century, and they wanted Resident Evil to continue to grow in congruence with it. To do this, Resident Evil 2 writer Noboru Sujimura and director Hideki Kamiya crafted an idea of a stylish action game. However, this was quickly shot down by Mikami because of the lack of survival horror elements. He did encourage the two to make the game though, just not as a Resident Evil entry. The game in question would eventually go on to become the first Devil May Cry, another one of Capcom's most successful franchises. Another big change in development would come in 2002 when the game went from being developed on the PlayStation 2 to the GameCube. Not only that, but it was slated to be a GameCube exclusive and would eventually become the headliner to a slew of games created by Capcom for Nintendo's new system, often referred to as the Capcom 5. It was at this time a new director would be installed into the team, a man called Hiroshi Shibata. The Fog version of Resident Evil 4 would be created under his watch, and though it was eventually scrapped, it did help lay the basic groundwork for the game that had yet to be laid at that point. It reintroduced Leon as the main character and retained the game's survival horror roots. Even though the team was happy with the current course of development, Capcom was not impressed with the sequel in its current state, and it was back to the drawing board. The restart led to the creation of the Hookman version in 2003. This build featured Leon fighting against some of the enemies first conceptualized in the development of the first Resident Evil, such as spirits, ghosts, and other paranormal entities like an apparition with a hook for a hand. This enemy would serve a similar concept to what the previous game's tyrants would. Mikami, like in the original, would be the one to shut this version down, as it again lacked what Capcom and the team itself were looking for. While it was lacking in many areas, there was one feature that left an impression on the development from this time on. A new camera angle was introduced in this version, an over-the-shoulder perspective that vastly improved combat from the previous entries. At this point, Capcom had to make a decision: allow Shibata one more try at the game, or return to somebody that helped form the series into what it was. Shibata wasn't necessarily doing a terrible job, as many of the ideas developed under his watch did find their way into the final game, but time was running out and Capcom didn't want a subpar product to be released when their deadline came. At least not yet. This meant that a change at director had to be made. For the final version of the game, Mikami would return to his original role and lead Resident Evil 4 into its latter stages of development. It was at this time that the 3D over-the-shoulder camera became a major focus for the RE4 team. While the technology at the time limited him from doing so, the power of the next generation of consoles allowed Mikami to build Resident Evil 4 in a similar way to how he pictured the first game. With this camera meant new combat, and Mikami wanted to shake up the usual enemies in the game. He didn't want to do a basic asset flip and drop the same old zombies from the first 5 games into the sequel. The increased capabilities and control of the player allowed for quicker, more difficult enemies to be added, similar to that of Zero, that would be used to showcase this new style of gameplay. The most controversial change that would be made during this final stretch would be a slight shift in genre. Shibata's development, while messy, did retain the usual survival horror feeling the previous games had. Mikami wanted to make tweaks to this, however. Believing that people, both fans and devs, were being burnt out, he made the choice to draw more focus to the action of Resident Evil 4. The remake of the original Resident Evil didn't sell very well, giving Mikami and Capcom the impression this title needed fun gameplay rather than scares in order to get more people to take interest. Though it is still classified as a survival horror game, it's a departure from the previous games that allowed action to take a back seat at times. After almost 6 years of development, Resident Evil 4 was released on January 11th, 2005 for the Nintendo GameCube. It was hard to say whether or not the game would be well received. For almost a decade, Capcom had built its Resident Evil fanbase around classic, tank-controlled survival horror. Even if people were getting sick of that format, there's always going to be heaps of anxiety before releasing a product that strays away from what's expected. Luckily for them, they created a masterpiece. Resident Evil 4, in the past and present, is one of the most universally loved games ever made. On top of this, it's also cited as one of the most influential games ever made in multiple different genres, specifically third-person shooters. Though it wasn't the first to use this angle, Resident Evil 4 is known for its use of the over-the-shoulder camera in which the player aims from a fixed position with free control of their reticle. This positioning helps prevent the player model from getting in the way of other objects on the screen and invited new challenges for both Resident Evil veterans and new players. It's almost impossible to play a third-person game today without having to give some credit to Resident Evil 4, as it popularized the camera that would become the standard in this style to this very day. Score-wise, it's hard to get much better than the marks Capcom was given. High 90s, 5 stars, A's, and a metric ton of awards and nominations, 12.3 million copies sold. The industry loved this game. Now, more than ever, the future of Resident Evil was incredibly exciting. With a larger fan base and more resources with the release of 4, the follow-up to one of the greatest games ever released was heavily anticipated. When you make a project that's seen as the pinnacle of anything, it's a massive confidence boost, but also a massive weight on one's shoulders. The momentum of this game would propel the series forward for some time, but the pressure of creating a masterpiece was hard to live up to. This led to the release of Resident Evil 5 and 6, two of the worst reviewed mainline Resident Evil games and two of the fan base's least favorites. That's not to say they were terrible games, they were still reviewed fairly well for the time, but it was an obvious step down from the previous entries. There were a few reasons for this. Like previously mentioned, Resident Evil 4 was a slight departure from the series' usual genre. It was still survival horror by name, but it was clear that the feel and function of the game played more along the lines of what would be described as action-adventure. And while this worked for 4, it was one of the reasons 5 and 6 were given below average ratings for the series as a whole. These games were often equated to action films and drew many comparisons to games that had come out since Resident Evil 4, such as Uncharted and more modern Tomb Raider games. They still featured infected enemies and other concepts that were present in the classics, but dropped most of the tension from their runtimes. Another gameplay element that was dropped was the free roam style used in all the previous games, including 4. Puzzle solving was a big part of this series, and most of the time that involved exploring a confined area, looking for clues, and returning to areas that were inaccessible previously. Oftentimes it was necessary to advance in the game, but most puzzles were optional and rewarded players for dedicating time to exploring the world thoroughly. Resident Evil 5 and 6 featured minimal, if not zero, of this. The games were strictly linear, and oftentimes backtracking was impossible. It may be obvious, but both of these games were directed by people who had not previously led a Resident Evil title. 5 was directed by rookie director Yasuhiro Ampo and a slightly more experienced Kenichi Ueda, who directed the first Devil May Cry game. 6 was led by Eiichiro Sasaki, who previously worked on Resident Evil Outbreak, an online spin-off. As you can see, in both instances, the directors of these games either had minimal experience directing games or had come from backgrounds outside of traditional survival horror. Like 2 and 4, this led to rocky development. For those games, however, the teams were able to salvage its development by focusing on what made Resident Evil great in the past and building off that in a way that didn't stray too far from what was loved about the franchise. 5 and 6 were made with the expectation to evolve and redefine what makes a Resident Evil game, and as a result, diverged too far from the series. Specifically, Resident Evil 5 was designed in a way so as many people as possible could enjoy the game according to Jun Takuchi, the game's producer. If this meant dropping the ideas that founded the series, they were willing to do that. The games were also massive, much bigger in scale than any Resident Evil game had ever been. This goes back to the removal of backtracking and again moves the series away from what it's used to, as many of the older games take place in one or very few areas. 5 and 6 both released to mixed to slightly positive reviews. They were both seen as okay, but garnered criticism for the reasons previously mentioned and for unique reasons, separate from the discourse of gameplay. Starting with Resident Evil 5, its controversy arose from its depiction of West Africans and mistreatment of women in Resident Evil as a whole. Attempting to continue a similar storyline as Resident Evil 4, 5's plot surrounds Chris Redfield and his partner Shiva going to Western Africa in an attempt to put down a bioterrorist threat. In the same vein as 4, the infected are the locals in the area, and while Resident Evil 4 does this in a more tasteful way, 5 was criticized criticized for using racial stereotypes when creating the enemies for this game. Race stands in for cultural evil. Even before becoming infected, the Africans are depicted as malevolent and savage. As Chris and Shiva walk through Kijuju, they encounter 3 villagers, beating a writhing human-sized sack with sticks, while on the other street, a group of armed men eye the pair threateningly. This controversy started with a trailer for the game, and discussion would continue well after the game was released. But it wasn't just the enemies Capcom got criticism for, it was their depiction of one of their main characters in the game too. Resident Evil games having female characters is nothing new. Characters like Jill and Claire played major roles in the stories of multiple games in the franchise. But Capcom had received criticism in the past for the depiction of these characters, being called out for over-sexualizing their female leads, which would continue in Resident Evil 5 among other things. Sheva serves as Chris Redfield's sidekick in this game. Unlike the previous female leads, Sheva is noticeably less involved in the story of this game and relies heavily on Chris to complete tasks, lacking the self-sufficiency given to women in this series. At its best, Resident Evil 5 feels tone-deaf, but in reality, it's plain to see the story and design of this game were built from a place of ignorance and long-standing stereotypes. Despite the controversy, however, Resident Evil 5 still sold extremely well, but got slightly worse reviews compared to the previous games. Still, the success justified the production of a sequel that doubled down on the action aspect of this new style, as it reaffirmed the belief that fans were sick of survival horror. Resident Evil 6, while not as controversial as the previous game in terms of its social context, stands out as one of the worst games in the franchise, and one that almost sunk the series as a whole. For all its flaws, Resident Evil 5 still maintains some horror aspects. It was more Uncharted than it was Silent Hill, but it still had the general feel of a Resident Evil game. 6 would attempt to take the series even further away from this, entirely dropping survival horror from its design and making these changes very evident. Playing this game on normal, you won't run short on ammo, health, or heals. It also includes a cooperative mode, which was present in 5 but wasn't as big of a focus as it is in 6. The feature is fun to play with, but it kills the already stripped tension from this game. The combat also leans heavily into the action, more so than any game before it, relying heavily on QuickTime events, hordes of weak, stupid, slow zombies, and artificial chaos that simply confuses the player. I swear on my life, there is a vehicle accident every 5 minutes during the first 2 hours of this game, and it sounds ridiculous, and I wouldn't believe it if I had not played the game, but it happens, and it is so funny. The writing in this game also does not help its case. Resident Evil has been corny since the beginning, but this silliness was always done well and is often used as a short moment of comic relief in light of the scariness.
Jill sandwich.
6 lacks this tension, however, giving the player time to roll their eyes rather than give a sigh of relief. That being said, the game is still kind of fun, but not in the ways of its predecessors. Resident Evil 6 is a great game to play with a friend and not pay too much attention to what's happening on the screen. But this series is supposed to be so much more than that. There's a serious lack of the soul the first 6 games were chocked full of, and fans were beginning to take notice. The initial 7 million in sales that were projected for the game was lowered to 6 million as the reviews began to roll in, which Capcom blamed on an unorganized development and poor marketing. This feels disingenuous, however, as it completely ignores the game's shortcomings. The third-person era of Resident Evil started off with a bang. Resident Evil 4 redefined the shooter, action, and survival horror genre forever. But following this success, Capcom would release 2 games that would put the series on a road that, if continued on, meant evident failure for the franchise. The move away from survival horror was one that was refreshing at first, but too jarring for the series as the games began to move further away from the title's roots and catastrophic when completely removed from them. From here, Capcom would take 2 roads, both of which would look to restructure Resident Evil back into what it once was in 2 very distinct ways. Capcom was not blinded by their sales numbers. They knew what was going on with their biggest title. The sales numbers were, of course, important and needed to stay high, but the reaction from fans, especially those who had been playing the games for almost 20 years, were decidedly negative. But at first, they didn't really care. In 2013, development of the next Resident Evil game was originally on the same path as the past three, reusing characters such as Leon Kennedy and taking place in a foreign area and a large scale. This build, Resident Evil 6.5, would fall apart in early development, and Capcom CEO Kenzo Sugimoto passed the executive producer role and task of reviving the series to former producer of Resident Evil 5, Jun Takeuchi. Takeuchi had been a member of the Resident Evil team since the first game as a designer and was very familiar with the series and its ins and outs. When given the job, Takeuchi decided this game needed to be made in contrast of the previous few games, ignoring the recent years of Resident Evil and starting fresh. He wanted to return Resident Evil to the forefront of the survival horror genre. Takeuchi wanted to make the scariest Resident Evil game ever made, and to do this, some serious changes needed to be made. For starters, he brought on some of the more experienced members of the Resident Evil team. Director Koshi Nakanishi and producer Masachika Kawada were both Resident Evil veterans, and Jun chose them for that reason exactly. Personally, I felt somewhat sad when we've tried various things and then had players say that Resident Evil has lost its identity or that Capcom needs to find its footing again. At the same time though, we now had this chance to present a new style of gameplay while going back to the roots of what makes the Resident Evil series so great. This new system of gameplay that Koshi is referring to is the first-person perspective used in this game, an idea that was considered in the early development of Resident Evil but was eventually scrapped due to technological drawbacks. Now, with their specially tailored Reach for the Moon or RE engine, the team was able to realize this image. The choice of the first-person camera came early in the development from Jun Takeuchi in an effort to re-horrify the series. A first-person camera is much more immersive than a third-person one, as limiting the player's line of sight creates much more vulnerability and allows for more visual scares. In a demo video shown to Capcom execs, this is shown off. This perspective was also chosen because of RE7's considerably smaller map design. The large-scale maps in the previous three games were a factor in limiting the horror aspect. Takeuchi wanted the player to feel horror in a more intimate way, which is why he made the choice to shrink the map size down and limit the game to mostly one location. As a result, the team constructed many tight rooms and hallways that would be, at their best, annoying to navigate with any other camera. But just because the map size of Resident Evil 7 was smaller doesn't mean it was a lesser experience. The Baker Ranch is an incredibly deep setting with new rooms, floors, and outside locations constantly being opened for the player, similar to that of the mansion in the first game and the RPD building in the second. With this scale, the game brought back many of the survival horror features that Resident Evil is known for. Puzzles, limited ammunition and heals, crafting, and backtracking were all central pieces to 7. Though many of the classic features were returning, there were also some major differences in gameplay, namely the low number of enemies. Resident Evil 7 is very tactical with its tension, often limiting enemy encounters to frequent boss fights and chase scenes. There are some zombie-like enemies and bugs that deal a small amount of damage to the player, but the majority of the difficulty comes from the larger scale bosses. Another change was the writing of this game. Lines like,
"You were almost a Jill sandwich,"
wouldn't work with this story. Resident Evil 7 takes itself the most seriously out of any of these games, and though it does have goofy moments, the use of comedy as a method of tension relief is almost entirely gone. This was all well and good, but none of this mattered if it didn't achieve the goal Capcom had set Takeuchi out with when the development of this game started: revive the Resident Evil series. Though it was, in my opinion, criminally under-reviewed, Resident Evil 7 was praised for being both an innovative take on a more than 20-year-old series while also returning to the roots of what made that series so great to begin with. The game pleased the oldest Resident Evil fans by providing them with a return to the genre they loved and drew in new fans with its impressive visuals and surprisingly strong VR mode. Because of this, the game sold incredibly well, toppling the fear that a horror game would suffer in sales compared to other genres. years. Takeuchi and Capcom had achieved their goal and more, and this led to the subsequent sequel of the game Resident Evil 8 or Village being developed. Though this game wouldn't be considered as strong of an entry into the series as its predecessor, Resident Evil 7 opened the door for a different type of game. With the hype around the series incredibly strong and new fans being brought in, Capcom took this opportunity to rehash old ideas and make them even better. For years, Resident Evil 2 director Hideki Kiyama had badgered Capcom's higher-ups about remaking the series' second entry. For a while, this was never in the picture, as Resident Evil was still in their action-adventure phase. This dream would become a reality in 2015, however, when Capcom approved the development of the remake of Resident Evil 2 and announced it in its iconic We Do It video. Still wanting to provide a survival horror experience, the team needed to decide what camera they were going to use for this game. The first-person camera from Resident Evil 7 was considered and likely would have been an easy transition because of the remake's use of the RE engine, but ultimately the team decided that their best option would be the return of the over-the-shoulder camera they popularized with Resident Evil 4 with a free movement system while aiming similar to that of Resident Evil 6. We looked into all kinds of possibilities and options during the long process of deliberation and consideration when it came to the camera, and it all came down to the feeling we want you to have when you play the game. We wanted to have the key pillars of scary survival horror and also a sort of so-called Metroidvania style exploration of the environment. But this RE4 style camera didn't mean that this was going to be made in its shadow. The goal for the Resident Evil 2 remake was to reintroduce horror to the series, similar to that of Resident Evil 7. The two were actually made side by side, and the development of 7 was said to be very beneficial to the creation of 2. However, though it was using the same engine and utilizing the survival horror aesthetic, Resident Evil 2 was made to be less realistic compared to 7. Capcom didn't want this remake to be a direct rip of the first game, but they wanted to retain many of the elements the original had, such as the larger-than-life story and characters, as well as its sometimes corny writing.
Hope I don't have to write a report on this.
Other than small changes to character design, tweaks with the map to improve gameplay, and the obvious camera shift, the game was largely unchanged from its original state, including the two-sided campaign. The game was decidedly creepier than the original, using the inspiration of dark, tight corridors from the 1998 version in 7 and a flashlight to increase the fear factor. On January 25th, 2019, the final version of Resident Evil 2 was released for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Windows and became an instant classic among fans, both new and returning. It was applauded for its modern take on an already great game and realization of the game's vision with powerful graphics 30 years later. This would shortly be followed by a remake of the sequel of the original game. That's confusing. On April 3rd, 2020, Resident Evil 3 was released, which is unfortunate because a zombie apocalypse game being released at the onset of a pandemic is always ironic, and B, this game is not very good, at least compared to Capcom's recent games. I'll admit, this one's kind of personal because I love 2 out of the 3 remakes from this era, and this one stands out like a sore thumb. It shocks me how this game was put into development shortly after the remake of 2 was being developed during the success of 7 and still chose to ignore all the progress made in returning Resident Evil to what it once was. The first hour of this game is fairly similar to the previous remake, but as the game progresses, it becomes more linear and slowly begins to fade into the trap that Resident Evil 5 and 6 did by trying to make the game like an action movie. It just baffles me how Resident Evil went through so much change during the past decade just to fall back into the mistakes they made a year after making 2 of the best horror games ever made. Anyway, Resident Evil 3 released to much worse reviews compared to 2, critics citing the lack of immersion and horror compared to the last game. I wonder why. The game also sold much worse than the previous. That being said, the game did have a few commendable features. The graphics were a definite bright spot. Resident Evil 2 looked good, but 3's use of the RE engine was on another level. The mobility of its characters was also much improved, something the first remake was lacking in comparatively. This wasn't wasn't a failure by any means. This game sold millions of copies, but it was definitely a disappointment. The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was a wonderful game, one that many older fans were excited to see get the love it deserved when it was announced it was getting a remaster, but this project fell flat. Big time. But for every failure Resident Evil has, it knows how to pick itself up well. Remaking a game that is already considered to be a masterpiece is a steep task. A subpar remake of the next entry in the series, Resident Evil 4, would surely turn many fans against Capcom. The game was in need of a refresh though. As influential as the camera was at the time, the fixed position of aiming was quickly improved upon by other developers and even Capcom themselves. The graphics were also very dated. Resident Evil 4 was re-released multiple times on many different consoles, including with its HD remaster, but even with this, it looked and felt ancient compared to more recent games. It was going to be tough, but Capcom knew that a remake of their greatest game would be a great benefit for them and the Resident Evil community, if they did it right. On March 24th, 2023, the remake of Resident Evil 4 was released for PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox Series S and X, and Windows. Fans and Capcom alike were biting their fingernails, hoping that this game met their expectations. Luckily for them, they made a masterpiece. Again. The Resident Evil 4 remake is regarded as a generational release, being given many perfect reviews for expanding on the concepts and ideas that the game was built on almost 20 years prior. Like with 2's remake, the developers didn't want this to just be another graphical improvement to the game, so they expanded on the game's side quest system, improved the AI, and modernized the movement and aiming. But the most important improvement that was made was, without a doubt, the combat. Like I've said many times, Resident Evil 4's combat was extremely influential and even influenced the modernized systems used in the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3. Bringing this camera into 4 was a no-brainer, and the inclusion of this, a Last of Us style weapon wheel, new weapons and combat systems to bring stealth into the equation, and most importantly parrying, all factored into this game's smooth, fast-paced combat. The previous remakes did have good fights, but feel incredibly limited in comparison to 4, which gives the player much more freedom in how you take out your enemies. These new powers didn't detract from the horror experience, however. Similar to their previous remake of 2 and pseudo-reboot of the series with 7 and 8, horror was brought to the forefront of this iteration. The action elements in the original are still present, but there are more moments of tension included in this version in an effort to continue on the path that they had been on recently and avoid the mistakes they made with 3's remake. 4 featured the best of both genres, and this resulted in one of Capcom's best-selling games in terms of volume in a short period of time, selling 3 million units within the first 3 days of its release and 5 million by July 2023. Like with 2 and 7, this once again proved that there was a position for survival horror in the industry and, when done right, can pay dividends for fans and developers. As of right now, there's no official announcement for the next Resident Evil game. Capcom did hold a survey in the summer of 2023 asking its fans which game they would like to see remade next, though no official results from such survey have been released. Fans are speculating that the next release in this line would likely be a remake of Code Veronica or 5. That's probably a long way out, however, and the most likely entry to come soon would probably be a follow-up to Resident Evil Village in the first-person style. Whatever game is coming next, fans can sleep peacefully knowing that it will most likely be in good hands. For every mistake Capcom has made throughout the Resident Evil series, they've always made up for these mistakes with some of the best survival horror games of recent memory. Building a franchise is difficult, and maintaining it for 3 decades can be even harder. It's understandable to have bumps in the road, especially when you're able to recover from them like Resident Evil has. From originally being a reskin of a popular NES game to creating the foundation for survival horror in the past and future, Resident Evil has cemented and re-cemented its place on consoles for years to come. And in whatever direction it may go, we'll be waiting for the next release eagerly. Unless they drop some hot garbage like this again, then I take back everything I said.
Jill sandwich.